Tonight we're going to talk about the Great Depression. And I'm one of those who views the Great Depression not as one big 12 or even 16-year lump of economic activity, but rather I think of it as having some fairly distinct phases. So I'm going to present this tonight to you in terms of the 4 phases of the Great Depression. And I want to start by pointing out to you that this was not the first depression in American economic history. We'd had a number of them before. The first cyclical depression in American history occurred after the War of 1812 and 1819. The next one happened in 1836 after the Second Bank of the United States was killed by President Andrew Jackson. A lot of its inflationary malinvestments were liquidated in the Panic and Depression of 1836. And on and on. There were several others leading up to the big one that began in 1929. But this one stands out in history by a number of important measures. Needless to say, it probably has had more impact on American psyche and American policy in the decades since than any other depression had on our thinking and subsequent policies. But more importantly, it lasted at least 4 times longer than any previous depression in American history. At least 4 times longer. All the others were over with in a year or 2 or 3, maybe 3.5 or 4 at the most. This one lasts at least 12 years, and if you consider some very important observations by economist Robert Higgs, suggesting that really the war years were not a time of recovery, certainly not for the consumer, you can add another 4 years and talk of this as probably a 16-year trough in the economy. And that makes it more than 4 times longer than any that came before. In fact, there is a little-known depression that happened just shortly before, within the same decade of the one that we'll talk about tonight. That was in 1921, a very short but very sharp depression after several years of inflation of money and credit to help accommodate the expenses for World War I. That was the last depression in which the government responded by pretty much doing what it ought to do, which is backing off, reducing its burdens on the economy, trying to balance the budget, reducing tax rates, allowing a wounded economy to heal. But we forgot that one for the most part, or we have forgotten it because it was so brief. The one that begins in 1929 goes at least to 1941, and by some measures, perhaps another 4 years. That cries out for an explanation. What caused it and what made it last so long? That's what I hope to answer for you tonight. The first phase of the Great Depression we call the phase of the monetary, the primary phase or the monetary or financial phase of the Depression. We could spend an evening, we could spend a whole course talking about booms and busts and where they come from. I have to radically condense that tonight, and I'll do so by suggesting to you that if you ever want to know where this roller coaster economy comes from, look at monetary policy, because it looks like a roller coaster. Erratic policies of the monetary authorities that first produce or stimulate an artificial boom by driving interest rates down through a creation of money and credit, stimulating a boom in the economy which is not sustainable. At some point, they reverse policy for any number of reasons. The house of cards collapses, and you have the depression phase of this cycle, stimulated first by monetary policy. That's Austrian economic trade cycle theory condensed into a couple minutes. If you apply that to the 1920s and ask yourself, well, before the collapse in 1929, did we have an inflation of money and credit? It's not very hard to find it. Murray Rothbard in America's Great Depression talks about an expansion of money and credit that might have been as much as 66% from about 1924 to late 1928. There's dispute over what's the best measurement, how extensive was the expansion of money and credit, but it was substantial. Interest rates were driven to very low levels. Some people will say, yeah, but if you look at prices in the 1920s, consumer prices, you find not much movement at all. This was a decade of relatively stable prices, so where's the inflation? But of course, those of us of the Austrian persuasion do not define inflation as rising prices. We define inflation as an increase in the quantity of money and credit, with rising prices being one of the effects of that. If you look at monetary policy, you find an extraordinarily accommodationist policy in the 1920s, from 24 to late 28, perhaps in part to accommodate a return by Great Britain to a gold standard. And normally that might be something to applaud, but Britain wanted to do it at a rate that did not accurately reflect the inflation it had conducted during the World War I, and to assist Britain to restore gold convertibility at an unrealistic rate, the Federal Reserve apparently made some agreements to weaken the dollar so as to help the British pound. That may have been one of probably multiple motivations for Fed policy, but it was extraordinarily expansionist. If you look at those consumer prices, yeah, you might say, well, it didn't show up there. But there are a number of things to consider when you look at those. One is you had some very substantial and very helpful tax rate reductions early in the decade and in the middle part of the decade, in the years that Secretary Andrew Mellon was Treasury Secretary. He's my favorite Treasury Secretary, by the way. A good friend, Bert Folsom, who wrote The Myth of the Robber Barons, figured out that if you look at the number of employees in the Treasury Department after the, I think, 11 or 12 years that Andrew Mellon was Treasury Secretary, it works out to he let go, about, on the average, about one Treasury Department employee for every day of the 11 plus years he headed the Treasury Department. He was the prime architect of the very substantial tax reductions in the 20s that brought the top rate down from in the 70s to about 24, 25%. And that stimulated a real boom in investment and productivity. And we had a cascade of goods pouring forth, an increase in productivity, which surely moderated what might have otherwise been a much more noticeable rise in prices. But if you look at certain prices, you can find there were some very substantial hikes in the 20s, reflecting this easy money policy. You had a land boom in Florida. Does that sound familiar? With prices in Florida soaring. You had stock prices, of course, reaching dizzy heights. So much of the newly created money perhaps found its way there. In any event, we had in the so-called roaring 20s a booming economy, at least in part fostered by an inflation of money and credit. But by late 1928, it became apparent to those who were looking at the right numbers that the Federal Reserve started to shift its policy away from a very accommodationist, expansionary, inflationary policy to much more tight monetary and credit policy. In fact, what begins by late 28, early 29, will be by 3 years later about a 1/3 contraction in the nation's money supply. And of course, there's a lot of discussion or debate among economists. Did the Fed really set out to accomplish that? Probably not. It certainly got out of control at some point. I don't think they engineered it with that in mind, of reducing the money supply by 1/3, but that's exactly what happened. So you have this roller coaster monetary policy, boom, followed by contraction. And you shouldn't be surprised that the economy roughly mirrors what was happening there in monetary policy. Some people will look at the events of October 24, 1929 in particular, and say, well, that's what caused the Depression. The stock market collapsed. Black Thursday, and then Black Monday, and Black Tuesday. You had black every day of the week before it's all over. And some people will say, that's what caused the Depression. The stock market fell apart, collapsed, and then dragged the rest of the economy down with it. But that ignores, I think, the much more fundamental trends taking place, this dramatic shift in monetary policy that not everybody saw, certainly not at first. The smart money, like the Bernard Baruchs and the Joseph P. Kennedys, they saw this shift. They realized, I think by late 28, early 29, that change was in the air. And certainly by the summer of 29, the smart money begins selling stock, and I think that's why the stock market actually peaked out a couple months before the big collapse in August of 29. The pressure of the selling of the smart money that watches things like monetary policy and trade patterns and actions of Congress and so forth causes the market to top out and begin to decline, and it's not until the masses of people sense change in the air and stampede and dump their stocks in late October that you have this very notable historic crash. If nothing else had happened, I think the chances might have been good that 1930 at some point might have been a year of stability, if not recovery. And this might have gone down in history as another episode of inflation of money and credit stimulating a boom, and then there's a correction, then the economy sloughs off the excesses and things move forward again. But something did happen in 1930 to take a very bad situation and make it far, far worse. And that leads me now to the second phase of the Great Depression. The first, again, was the primary or financial phase, the monetary phase. It explains why the Depression began in the first place, what set us up for a corrective adjustment that we look back and call a depression. It's the subsequent phases that explain what kept us in depression and in fact made it worse for a time. The second phase of the Great Depression we call the disintegration of the world economy, the disintegration of the world economy. You have to think back to the context of that time. This is, say, imagine the spring of 1930. The stock market, which collapsed in October and had a lot of bad days through the end of the year, actually had recovered about half of the ground it had lost by late spring 1930. Unemployment was not yet at depression levels. They were not yet at double-digit levels, about 8.5%, less than we have today. Lower unemployment rate in 1930, early part of 30, than we have today, about 8.5 to 9%. So what is it that happens in this second phase that takes a recession, in effect, and makes it a depression? Folly of the first order. And it came in the form of the Smoot-Hawley tariff passed by Congress and signed by President Hoover in June of 1930. The Smoot-Hawley tariff raised tariffs to an all-time high, highest in American history, highest we've had to this date as well. No tariff regime has ever been higher than what Smoot-Hawley established in June of 1930. And by raising tariffs to such stratospheric levels, it virtually closed the borders. Now, what was the reasoning behind the Hoover administration and the Republican Congress in passing the Smoot-Hawley tariff? Well, they looked around and they saw this nagging unemployment that was rising, off-year elections scheduled for the fall of 1930. The incumbent party doesn't want to go into elections with unemployment at such levels. They felt they had to do something, and they thought that if we raise tariffs on imports, then we can encourage Americans to buy fewer imports because we'll make them more expensive. And then Americans instead will buy more goods made here. And that'll stimulate employment and help to spread prosperity into ever-widening circles. That was the thought. Keep those cheaper foreign goods out with high taxes on them, and Americans then will buy more goods made at home, and that'll put those unemployed people back to work. By the way, I've never figured out why, but it's curious, in that regime of higher tariffs, a lot of goods that were not tariffed before are tariffed for the first time, and many others were raised. But there were specific exemptions included in the act for leeches and skeletons. And I've always suspected that maybe the American Medical Association lobbied for that. I have no idea, but leeches and skeletons, in the infinite wisdom of Congress, they somehow knew that, yeah, leeches and skeletons, it would be good not to tariff them. But almost everything else was, from wool rags to auto parts, you name it. The thinking was this would put people back to work, but trade is ultimately a two-way street. You can't close the door to imports without sooner or later closing the door to exports. If foreigners cannot sell here because of our high tariffs, how can they earn the dollars that they need to buy here? And I mean, that's bad enough even before you assume that foreigners might respond and retaliate, which they did, making this situation even worse. Foreign governments said, well, if you're going to do that to us, we're going to do it to you. Smoot-Hawley helped to ignite a worldwide trade war. And we were not the only country to raise tariffs. Many others did it as well in retaliation for our Smoot-Hawley tariff. One particular American industry was especially hard hit by the Smoot-Hawley tariff because about a third of what it had been producing was sold in overseas markets. And that industry was agriculture. About a third of what American farmers were producing was being sold in overseas markets, but now with the stroke of the presidential pen, those markets pretty much disappeared. Foreigners couldn't buy those goods because they couldn't sell theirs to us and earn the dollars that would have purchased American farm goods. So you had thousands of American farmers walking off the farms in bankruptcy. When you look back at the bank failures of the period, you'll find that they're overwhelmingly concentrated in rural areas. These are the banks that held the farm mortgages. They go belly up because their clients now are broke. You may have seen newsreels of farmers dumping milk in ditches, slaughtering large numbers of baby chicks because it didn't pay to raise them to maturity. Prices plummeted because markets were choked off. And you had at the same time the Fed continuing to engineer this contraction of the money supply. You had plummeting prices, disappearing markets, farmers going broke by the tens of thousands. The recession of late 29 and early 30 rather quickly snowballs by year end into full-scale depression with double-digit unemployment heading to the vicinity of 20%. Ultimately, the worst of the unemployment in the Great Depression years will be in the neighborhood of 26, 27% by about 1933. Now, so we're now by late 30, clearly in a depression, double-digit unemployment. The situation's getting worse, not better. Before we get to the third phase of the Depression, I have to include another event that happens, not so much because it's related to the world economy, it isn't. It's a purely domestic matter, but it happens chronologically before the third phase, so I want you to know about it. It's a very significant factor, but not a world economy factor. It happens in 1932, okay? 1932 with unemployment now in excess of 20%. This is a presidential election year, and a lot of people are very concerned about what's happening in 1932 to the federal deficit. We still had a lot of folks who felt pretty strongly about old virtues of balanced budgets and so forth, and what do you suppose is happening to the federal budget by 1932? You have a reluctance on the part of the very interventionist Hoover administration to reduce expenditures. They're raising them, in fact, and doing all sorts of other things in the economy, bailing out companies, starting a reconstruction finance corporation, and jacking up tariffs and what have you, hardly a laissez-faire regime. And here you had people unemployed and closing their business stores, businesses going belly up, not paying taxes, so revenue falls through the floor at the same time that spending does not fall to meet the shortfall in revenues. So you have this yawning deficit by 1932 that begins to alarm people, and Republicans at that time, still in charge of Congress and the White House, had always preached the virtues of balanced budgets, so they want to do something about this. Well, you can at least attempt to balance a budget in a couple of ways. You can cut spending to meet the shortfall in revenue, or you can try to get more revenue. And so in 1932, they opted for the latter course and passed the Revenue Act of 1932. Here's what it did, and just, again, picture this now, 20% plus unemployment, deep in depression. Would it occur to any of you to do this as a way to either help the economy or balance an unbalanced budget? They passed the Revenue Act, which doubled the income tax. In fact, the top marginal rate went up by more than a doubling. It went from about 24% to 65% under the Revenue Act of 1932. So what that meant was, if you hadn't already been flattened by Smoot-Hawley and the other interventions of the Hoover administration, if you were still making any money, now you stood to see your tax burden substantially increased at the higher levels, as much as a doubling or more on your income. This is not a prescription for recovery. This was a prescription for deeper depression, and in fact that's precisely what we got, including a deeper deficit. It didn't solve the deficit problem either. The deficit went in the other direction. This is a presidential election year, 1932, and after all these interventions, not to mention, there's so much more you could talk about with regard to Hoover. He even tried to keep wages from falling, though prices were falling across the board. So he was pushing and jawboning businesses to keep an important cost of doing business, namely wages, at lofty levels, even though prices of goods were tumbling, raising the costs of employment, producing only more unemployment in the process. But in any event, with all of these interventions producing only more havoc in the economy and soaring unemployment, Herbert Hoover gets renominated by the Republicans and is going to run on a platform of, stick with him long enough, he'll get us out of depression. Not a very auspicious occasion for any incumbent, let alone what this guy with what he had done, to try to run for re-election. His problem is compounded by the fact that the Democrats nominate the silver-tongued, charismatic governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. If I had been around in 1932 and believe, as I do now, about the importance of limited government, small government, especially in times of depression, I would have voted for Franklin Roosevelt because he ran on a platform of reducing the size and the scope of government. It was in the Democratic Party platform that if the Democrat nominee became president, he would, and Roosevelt never denied this or never ran away from it, they promised to reduce federal spending by 25%. 25% reduction in federal spending. That was in the Democratic Party platform of 1932, on which Franklin Roosevelt ran. If you look at the rhetoric that the Roosevelt-Garner team used against the Hoover administration, you'll find it sounds like it came from Bumper Hornberger at the Future of Freedom Foundation. Roosevelt says that Hoover was presiding over the greatest spending administration in peacetime history. He assailed him for jacking up taxes and tariffs and choking off trade. His running mate, John Nance Garner from Texas, actually used this phrase. He said, "Hoover is leading the country down the path to socialism." Now, how does that square with what you might have learned in your history books, say, in high school? Almost all of us have gone through courses where they talk about Hoover was the laissez-faire, hands-off, didn't do anything president. He just sat back. The economy of its own weight fell apart, and he didn't do anything to lift us out of it, and then Franklin Roosevelt had to save us from the Great Depression. Well, I hope I've so far answered at least part of that myth, that Hoover was not a laissez-faire president. And you don't have to take my word for it. Take Franklin Roosevelt's word for it. So that's what I would urge you to do when you run into somebody who makes that claim. And if they're a big FDR advocate, quote FDR for them and say, well, how do you square that with what he said? He said Hoover was leading the country down the path to socialism. Well, FDR, of course, wins in a landslide in 1932. He comes in March of 1933 and becomes very quickly a virtual economic dictator. By virtue of the fact that the country is desperate for answers, he gives great speeches, soothing to the country, and the Congress doesn't know what to do. He's obviously won a mandate. What does he want to do? Let's let him do it. And so the first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration, we get the inauguration of the New Deal. That leads me now to the third phase of the Great Depression, the phase of the New Deal. Third phase. This explains why a depressed situation now gets a little worse and then continues to linger for much of the rest of the decade. Okay? The phase of the New Deal. The New Deal embraces a lot of stuff. And it's not just legislation, it's also the rhetoric from the new administration, which is almost continually anti-enterprise, anti-business. That even picks up and gets more virulent in the second Roosevelt term. But the legislation that was passed had real, tangible, far-reaching, and deep ramifications, harmful for the economy. And there are two pieces of legislation in particular I want to zero in on. Two that I think bear the blame for taking this bad situation and keeping it bad, making it a bit worse in 33 and 34. The first one is the National Industrial Recovery Act. NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, passed within the first 100 days in 1933. This was prompted by the Roosevelt administration's theory that there was too much competition in the American economy. We have plummeting prices. That seems to hurt. Everybody likes their prices to be up, and yet they keep going down. Well, of course they are. You've choked off trade with Smoot-Hawley. You've got the Fed contracting the money supply. Markets are plunging all over the world. But the thought that this was due to excessive competition and that the answer was to stifle competition was absurd. And here's what it led them to do. The National Industrial Recovery Act attempted to cartelize or monopolize industries, try to get industries singing out of the same hymn book in terms of their prices and their practices. It imposed price controls, codes, and other regulations designed to keep prices up. There's a famous case I referred to in the essay of a man named Jack Magid from New York City, as I recall, who was prosecuted under the NRA he was a tailor. He pressed a suit of clothes for the price of 35 cents in violation of the NRA code, which was 40 cents. Now think of it, we're in the midst of a depression. You're lucky if you got a suit of clothes, let alone the money to have it pressed. And here's a guy who says, I'll press your clothes for 35 cents. He goes to jail because the government says, he should have charged you 40. And that's a prescription for recovery? But in a microcosm, that is what the NIRA was attempting to do across the board throughout the economy. They put a guy in charge of it by the name of General Hugh Iron Pants Johnson. That was his nickname, Iron Pants. He was a professed admirer of Benito Mussolini. Mussolini hadn't yet made the headlines that he would make later in the decade that would cause us all to despise him. He hadn't yet invaded Ethiopia, things like that. But he had a reputation already as a strong man who was going to order the economy to recover and make the trains run on time and so forth. And this was something that Iron Pants Johnson liked. Hey, we're in a depression. We just got to tell people, you're going to do this, you're not going to do that, and we will order our way or parade our way out of the depression. They had parades down Main Street America with flags. They had the symbol for the NRA, the National Recovery Administration that the NIRA set up. The symbol for it was the Blue Eagle. And the administration tried to whip up patriotic sentiment, hey, if you're with the administration, you're for America, and you should carry flags and banners and stick the Blue Eagle in your window to show solidarity with the New Deal attempt to get us to recover. All this did was to raise the costs of doing business. One guy's price is another man's cost. And by decree, preventing competition, preventing prices from going down, all you did was raise the costs of doing business by some estimates as much as 40% across the economy. Some industries like housing and construction, probably even more. This is not a prescription for recovery, and yet that's what it was sold as. It contributed to the continued decline in the economy by preventing adjustments and raising the costs of doing business. But if you think that was something, the other piece of New Deal legislation I want to focus on, if you haven't heard of this, will raise your eyebrows even more. And that is the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Okay, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Don't you love the names that they give these things? It can be the most harmful thing to come down the pike, but they come up with these high-sounding names. National Industrial Recovery. Who can be opposed to that? Agricultural Adjustment Act. Agriculture needed adjustment. No question about it. It was in the tank. And this did adjust agriculture. I like to say that it adjusted agriculture just like falling out of an airplane will adjust your neck. Here's what it did. It levied a new tax on agriculture. Boy, there's an innovative idea. You take a depressed industry and tax it more, and that'll help us recover. Levied a new tax on agricultural processors in particular like millers and refiners, and used the revenue to pay for programs to destroy perfectly healthy cattle, sheep, and pigs by the millions and to plow under perfectly good, healthy fields of crops like corn, wheat, cotton, and so forth. There's a famous line, I don't recall to whom it was attributed, but a farmer who talked about how difficult it was. He had trained his mules to walk between the rows. But now under the AAA, he had to train the mules to stomp on the crops, not to walk between the rows, but to walk on the rows. And the mules didn't want to do it. It was very hard to get them to change, which, what does that say about the relative intelligence of mules versus Congress at the time? The mules had it right. Well, in one particular order, by the way, Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace issued in one particular order, he ordered the destruction of 6 million baby pigs under the AAA. 6 million of them. They weren't sick. It was because we were trying to reduce the supply so as to raise the price. The theory being if farmers get a higher price, of course they're selling less, but if they get a higher price, then they'll make more money. And they'll spend it on fertilizer or what have you, and that'll help the economy recover. But even if it had helped the farmer, it could have done so only at the expense of everybody else. This is redistribution through destruction. And I wish I could stand before you as an economist and say, aha, here's a way to prosperity or to economic recovery in bad times. You just destroy things of value. I wish I could stand here and tell you, yeah, that works, let's do that. Because it's easy to do. Government is an expert at it. It doesn't take much brains. The hard part is creating the stuff in the first place. Destroying it, you can have a lot of fun with that. But it is not synonymous with economic recovery or productivity or growth or solving problems in a depressed economy. This is an interesting time period for a lot of reasons, but I'll just parenthetically, I'll mention that something else happened about this time, and it wasn't me who first explained this, but I can't recall who it was, who pointed out how times had changed so dramatically in the course of a year that Roosevelt was doing all this stuff. And it had to do with the repeal of prohibition and the seizure of gold. Roosevelt seized American gold holdings under a penalty of $10,000 or I think 10 years in prison. You had about a month to turn in your gold coins it was either 33 or 34 when that happened. And it was about the same time when Roosevelt thought the country needed a good stiff drink, so he pushed for repeal of prohibition. And whoever it was that wrote this up, sometime I recall reading it, where this guy pointed out that a year before, if you had two men walking down the street, one of them with a bottle of booze in his hand and the other one with a gold coin in his pocket, the one with the gold coin was an honest citizen and the guy with the bottle of booze was a criminal. A year later, it was just the opposite. The guy with the booze, hey, nothing wrong with that. The guy with the gold coin in his pocket who didn't turn it in, he's the crook in the space of 1 year, thanks to Franklin Roosevelt. And we would not regain the right to own gold coins until the mid-1970s. Well, under the weight of the NIRA and the AAA, the American economy continues to reel in depression. But around 1930, late 35, 36, we begin to see signs of life once again. Unemployment begins to fall to somewhere around 15%, as I recall, well below 20. What happens? Well, we got relief from those two acts of Congress that I just mentioned. We got some relief from unexpected quarters. The Supreme Court declared both of those acts unconstitutional. They were on the books for a year, year and a half, maybe two, not quite two, I think, in either case. And then the Supreme Court threw them both out. And in the process of doing that, they earned Roosevelt's unending wrath. He will begin to call the court those 9 old men. Now, that'll come back in just a moment, but for the moment anyway, he's very angry at the Supreme Court for throwing out the NRA and the AAA. Well, if nothing else had happened, perhaps the economy might have continued to show some signs of improvement. But then in 1937, Franklin Roosevelt achieves a first. a depression within a depression. In 1937, we have one of the swiftest collapses in American economic activity in a matter of months. Unemployment breaches 20% again, industrial production grinds to a halt. What happens in 37? That leads us to the fourth phase of the Great Depression. The fourth phase, which we call the phase of the Wagner Act, W-A-G-N-E-R, the Wagner Act. And it's that particular legislation that I'll focus on as having the most impact in explaining the 37 collapse. But before I get to it, I want to tell you of some other things Roosevelt was doing that contributed to the collapse in 37 and the lingering depression for years thereafter. One was the Supreme Court packing scheme. Remember, in 1936, he runs for re-election. You have to give the man credit. He, in the midst of all this meddling that wasn't producing recovery, he was still giving great fireside chats, and people thought, well, he's trying, and he won re-election handily in 1936. The Republicans put up a very weak candidate who came across by election day as kind of a Me Too FDR light named Alf Landon from Kansas. And he only carried 2 states, and that became the start of that old saying, as Maine goes, so goes Vermont. Those are the only, he didn't even carry Kansas in 1936, his own home state. So Roosevelt, fresh from a re-election victory and what he thinks is a new mandate, he goes after the Supreme Court. That body that had thrown out his favorite 2 centerpieces of the New Deal, he decides, I've got to neutralize their ability to block my stuff. But he can't call for their impeachment. I mean, these guys had called the shots as they saw them. They didn't do anything impeachable. They just disagreed and said why, and had good grounds for saying so. So he has to come up with another way to try to remove the court as an obstacle. So he comes up with this proposal to the Congress that goes like this. For every justice who reaches the age of 70 and who does not voluntarily retire under this FDR proposal, the president should get to appoint 1 new one to sit on the court and help him out. If that had passed, I believe the number is 5 new justices could have been appointed by FDR. He could have packed the court with a new batch of justices to counter those who had been against him. Now, you might wonder, well, how does this political gambit have any economic implications? It lasted for a number of months, 7, 8 months, I think, in 1937 as the Congress debated this. It's the first big battle that he lost. His own party went against him. But as long as it was hanging fire, I think there were a lot of investors who thought, I'm going to wait to see how this thing pans out. Because if he gets this, then all that New Deal stuff's coming back. I think if I'd been around then and had a little money to invest, I probably would have waited too to see, hey, what's going to happen here? I'm not going to take a risk and take a chance if the court is our last bulwark against the worst of FDR. If he takes it over too, it's not going to be a very good climate to invest. So that didn't help in 1937. He also had a reversal of Fed policy. The Fed, which had become a bit expansionist again in the mid-30s, now slams on the brakes and begins jacking up interest rates in 37. Again, the roller coaster monetary policy that ultimately always has implications for the economy at large. Shifting, in this case, from expansion again to contraction in 1936 and 37. Then you had, in 37, the undistributed profits tax proposal from FDR. You know that when a corporation makes a profit, it can retain some of the earnings for itself. Undistributed profits or retained earnings becomes an important source of internal capital for expansion. It can divvy it up amongst its shareholders. That would be distributed profits. Well, by 37, Roosevelt's coming under the influence of people like John Maynard Keynes, who kept saying that the problem in the economy was there's not enough spending. And you've got all these companies, for instance, that are retaining their earnings instead of divvying it up to their shareholders who would then spend it. So we got to get them to get it out there in the pockets of shareholders. So not so much as a revenue raiser, but rather as a penalty for businesses that retain earnings instead of giving it to their giving them to their shareholders, Roosevelt calls for an undistributed profits tax of 85%. So think of it. He's in the midst of depression. He's saying, oh, you made some money? Oh, and you didn't give it to your shareholders? I want 85% of it. This is the guy who saved us from the Depression, and we were still in it well into the second term. In fact, there's a great line I quote in here in that essay from his Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, in his diaries, 1939, 6 years after Roosevelt took office, where he says, we've tried everything, all this spending, nothing works. That's Roosevelt's own Treasury Secretary. So Roosevelt pushes for this 85% undistributed profits tax. Congress doesn't give him one that high. It gives him one of 35%. How generous. Harmful though it was, it passed, and they repealed that a year later when they realized the harm that it had done. All during these years and into the war years, Roosevelt will look for every opportunity to jack up taxes. Do you know what the top income tax rate will go to at its peak under Roosevelt? It would only be cut later by Eisenhower by 1 point before Kennedy reduced it, and then Reagan later. But the top income tax rate that Roosevelt inherited of 73% under Hoover, he took to 91%. He wanted a top income tax rate much closer to 98%. And there was a debate on that in the Congress, but it was defeated when some Midwest congressmen coming from states that had 2, 3, 4% state income taxes, they said, wait a minute, if he gets 98, how are we going to get our 3 or 4 or whatever? So they didn't go that high. But then in reaction to Congress not giving him that sky-high 98% income tax rate, Roosevelt imposes by executive order a 100% income tax rate on all incomes in excess of $25,000. Boy, there's a winner for you, right, of an idea for in the midst of a depression. Just take everything at beyond $25,000. It didn't last, had minimal impact because Congress overrode it. If it had ever gone to be challenged in the courts, I think it probably would have been thrown out. But that's what he was trying to do. He tried to get everything that you might earn beyond $25,000. This is the climate in which people are deciding, I've got a little money here, do I invest it or do I hide it? What do I do with it? I think it's pretty apparent what most thinking people would do with it when you've got government wanting to swipe virtually every penny of it. But as bad as all that is, it's the Wagner Act that probably did more damage and explains the 37 collapse better than anything else. This was formerly known as the National Labor Relations Act, sometimes referred to as Labor's Magna Carta. It bestowed vast new powers upon organized labor. It took labor disputes, I should say, out of the ordinary courts and turned them over to be settled by a new body called the National Labor Relations Board, which we still have today, presidential appointees to help settle labor disputes. It made it far easier for organized labor to strike, to organize, and it went on the warpath. The number, it was a study a few years ago by 2 UCLA economists showing that the number of strike days from 1936 to 1937, as the Wagner Act took hold, rose, it doubled from about 14 million strike days. That would be like 14 million people on strike for 1 day or 7 million on strike for 2 or however, but 14 million strike days in 1936 to 28 million strike days in 1937. The year of the sit-down strikes in Flint and Saginaw and Detroit, Michigan that shut down the auto plants. Industrial production under the weight of this wave of union militancy plummeted. Labor costs soared. Not what you need in the midst of a depression when profits have already been under assault by any number of other influences. The economy, some of these special privileges, by the way, Congress will later whittle away at. It'll make possible state right-to-work laws and so forth. But in 37, we got the worst of it all as the Wagner Act took effect. The economy will linger in depression. The war begins, of course, for us at the end of 1941, for Europe a couple of years before that. Some people look at the war and they say, well, that's what finally got us out of depression. And there's a kernel of truth in that, but a lot of potential for dangerous conclusions. Wars are usually financed to a great extent by an expansion of money and credit. And so when that happens, sometimes you get a lift, short-term lift in the economy, but it's not because we're taking things of value and blowing them up. It's because of the monetary effects of financing the conflict. We took 11 million unemployed and sent them to Europe. That helped on the unemployment rate. But when you look at measures of consumer welfare, during the war years, you don't see much improvement. People's lives didn't change. We weren't buying cars because they weren't making them, or refrigerators. We had price controls and rationing. You really didn't get a sustained and noticeable recovery in consumer welfare until after the war, until after Roosevelt, who dies in March of 1945. It's not an exaggeration to say the economy recovered when Roosevelt didn't. In 1945. And you have to give Harry Truman a little bit of credit. When he was president, you didn't have the same level of constant attack on Wall Street and people of enterprise. He got rid of some of the more radical New Dealers. It was a bit more or less hostile to business administration after the war. And then, of course, you had a drastic reduction in federal expenditures after the war, which helped a sick economy recover. Well, to sum up, he who can look at this parade of events from the monetary policy of the 20s and 30s that was so erratic, so harmful, to the closing of the borders, the jacking up of taxes, and all the other interventions I've mentioned, and say that the Great Depression was caused by the free market, and that government as an innocent bystander had to come in and save us is just utterly, woefully misinformed. This is one of the saddest chapters in economic history, and the blame for it should rest squarely and completely at the doorstep of government. With that, I thank you for being so attentive, and I'll be happy to take some questions. Thank you.
I've got two questions, actually. I'd like to get your opinion on Ron Paul's auditing the Fed initiative currently underway, and the other, I'd like to hear your opinions on President Obama's bank stress tests.
Okay. Boy, I'm more stressed out about what he's doing than I think the banks are. On your first question about Ron Paul's effort to audit the Fed, well, I'm all in favor of it, and I know Ron will be the first to add a little addendum here that effort will be worthwhile if it results not only in opening up the Fed, but if it results ultimately in its abolition. I can hardly think of another arm of government, agency created by government, that has more fully and destructively failed the promises that we were sold over the years about what it would do for us than the Federal Reserve. Over the years, we've been told that this organization, this central bank, would iron out the business cycle. It would promote full employment. It would be careful to provide just the right amount of currency. It would do all those wonderful central planning things that a central bank is supposed to do. But what have we had in the year since 1913 when it was created? One Great Depression you can lay at its doorstep. Even Ben Bernanke is admitted to that. 9 or 10 or 12 recessions linked in each case to an erratic monetary policy of the Fed. A dollar that's worth maybe a nickel of what it was when the Fed started out. I mean, that is manifest total failure. And if a private firm had been put in charge and told, this is what you must do for us, provide just the right amount of money, blah, 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 do all these other things, gee, I think they'd be swinging from trees by now. I mean, seriously, I think we'd be running them out of town for that kind of performance. So, so I'm all for auditing it, but I hope I hope the process produces more awareness of just how harmful this institution is. And then the bank stress tests that, I can't say I'm much of a student of that. I haven't looked at them carefully, but I can offer maybe a more broad interpretation or opinion of the whole stimulus effort. Let me add a dimension you might not have heard as much. I mean, you've all heard, because you have great economists here, some, I'm sure, very good economic critiques of the stimulus. Let me just add a bit of a moral one, too. Because ultimately, I think so many of our economic problems stem from some moral sins we're committing. And if I were to ask you, is it right to take a dollar from the responsible and give it to the irresponsible? Most of you would probably say there's something wrong about that, right? Is it right to take a dollar from the innocent and give to the guilty? Most people would say, oh, that's not a good idea either. Is there anything about doing that 1 trillion times that makes it right? Aren't you just 1 trillion times more wrong? And yet that's what we're doing on a grand scale. And somehow when you rip off people to this extent, to the trillions of dollars, you forget the moral underpinnings of it all. And it's hard for me to see how a policy that is rooted fundamentally in the immorality of seizing money from some who didn't cause a problem and giving it to those who were part of the problem, it's hard for me to see how the end result of that is good policy, good outcomes. At best, you're patching over a problem for the moment and perhaps making it worse for the long run.
Okay, so I was listening to your speech, and I was also looking at Romer 92, what ended the Great Depression, and Anna Schwartz and Friedman's analysis on monetary history. Now, they seem to think that the Depression, both the initial one and the one we had in end of 37, 38, was entirely caused to exogenous money supply shocks, and we can pretty much ignore everything FDR did as either inconsequential or besides the fact. Would you agree with that statement?
I would agree with it to this extent. I think if that what happened with monetary and credit policy in both cases was sufficient to cause, first a boom and then a bust to some degree. But I don't think it explains the depth or the severity or the duration. And I do think that these other things that Roosevelt was doing had very substantial negative impact. So I would just maybe not emphasize monetary policy. I certainly wouldn't emphasize it exclusively. I think these other factors were severe.
Wouldn't the fact that the Fed has destroyed 96% of the dollar's purchasing value since 1913 boost our exports?
Or to boost our exports?
It's a joke, actually.
Where do you go to school?
I just always thought that argument, destroy the dollar. Weimar Germany really had a great export market in the 20s. No, building on that question, the Friedman-Schwartz argument seems to me they take the monetarist argument, and they forget all the policy and all the disruptions that the federal government has created with its regulation, not only, and also with its rhetoric. When you say that there's a monetary contraction, I've read differently, and I'm not an expert.
What?
You said there was a monetary contraction in the 30s. My question is the source of that contraction. Was it intentional? Because I've read that what caused the monetary contraction was the fact that 1 out of every 3 banks in the United States failed, which causes the monetary contraction. But that wasn't intentional.
No,
it was caused by the fractional reserve banking system. The fact that the bank's banking system is fundamentally unstable. It's that's the fractional banking system, and that there was an attempt really to add money to the system, but there was an effect of pushing on a string that there were no markets. Banks were nervous, and they didn't want to loan anymore. They built up reserves, and no one was willing to borrow anyway. So there was a pushing on a string. Is that a correct analysis?
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. In fact, that's why I hope I used this phrase when I was describing monetary policy. If I didn't, I want to clarify now. I like to describe what the Fed was doing from 29 to 33 as presiding over a substantial contraction. They did intend to slow the growth rate of money. I'm not certain that they intended actually to reduce it to any degree, but it quickly snowballed beyond even their intent. But I think that's still attributable to the house of cards and the bad monetary policy they put in place that came before it.
Yeah, would it be fair to say it still is an indictment of monetary policy?
Exactly,
and
exactly.
principle.
And this is where I would part company with the this is another reason I would part company somewhat with the monetarists, because inherent in their analysis is the notion that, well, there should be a government monetary policy. We just need better planners, and we need them to be more reasonable and stable and so forth. And I never could quite buy into that, because I look at, I think money's too important to trust it to the government. I would give the government generally the things that aren't very important. But I wouldn't trust a presidentially appointed committee of 7 people, or whatever the number is, to decide what the supply of green beans ought to be. I always use green beans as an example. I don't think they'd have a clue what the supply ought to be. So where the notion comes from that, well, 7 different people, they could tell what the money supply ought to be, I think that's a pretense to knowledge, as Hayek might say. I don't think any 7 people know what it ought to be, which is all the more reason to leave it to the marketplace, not to 7 appointees of the president.
Larry, would you talk a little bit about the climate of what was going on during the NIRA with respect to how government was treating recalcitrant businessmen, people that refused to go along with the program and the Blue Eagle campaign, and maybe in the context of your mention of Benito Mussolini and what he was doing in Italy?
Yeah, the Roosevelt administration used many strong-arm tactics. I can think of a couple notable, colorful examples of Henry Ford. As I recall, the Roosevelt administration attempted to, they did yank some contracts that I think Ford had with the government for vehicle production, specifically because he was resistant to New Deal and NIRA measures. Sewell Avery, the guy who founded, I think, Montgomery Ward Company, the retailer, agents of the government actually went in and hauled him out of his office in his chair, hauled him out because he would not abide by price codes under the AAA. Others or the NIRA. The FDR sicked the IRS on people, probably more than any other administration until Nixon, maybe even more than Nixon. One notable person he went after, ultimately he was completely vindicated, was former Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon. FDR went on a crusade to try to nail him and just harassed him for years by sicking the IRS on him. So there were a lot of strong-arm tactics like that. The monies that the administration was getting from Congress for relief purposes were often politicized. Bert Folsom, in his book, New Deal or Raw Deal, documents a lot of cases where money went to the pockets of Democratic Party activists in the name of stimulus and designed instead to build up the Democratic Party. There was a lot of that kind of stuff going on throughout these years. Does that answer your question, Bubba? Yeah.
You've put a lot of time and energy in explaining the past. I'd be interested to hear your perspective on our near-term future.
Our near-term future. Ooh, if I knew that, I'd be a billionaire. Well, I tell you, let me put it this way. I'm very concerned about what they're doing in Washington, because I don't think they're doing anything that will give us anything more than a short-term lift at best, at the expense of the continued, perhaps accelerating erosion of the currency, and of course the growth of government. And so we might get a lift in the short run. There's some evidence that maybe we are now. Maybe things have stabilized and the economy is rebounding. We have to ask ourselves, is that because the economy has been allowed to go through the adjustment process, the malinvestments of the previous artificial credit-induced boom have been liquidated? To some degree, yes, but I think largely no. It's the lift I think we're getting might be nothing more than the effects of the $1 trillion in new money and rock bottom interest rates. And that's not a long-term sustainable policy. This morning's Wall Street Journal carried a story about, well, what will Mr. Bernanke do in coming weeks and months? He knows that if he is to forestall some burst of price inflation, that a lot of that $1 trillion he's pumped in has to be pulled out. And so now the question is does he have enough revelation from God to be the skillful central planner and know precisely the right time to do all this? It's the same crowd that caused the problem. I don't have any confidence that they know what they're doing. We might get a short-term lift, but I fear that the long-run consequences of what we're doing now are horrific in terms of our pocketbooks and, more importantly, in terms of our liberties, unless we soon reverse it.
I'll take a program director's prerogative here. And you were talking about the election of 1932 and how Roosevelt was attacking Hoover for his non-laissez-faire policies. I mean, 100 days is a pretty quick turnaround to install the New Deal. Can you give us some of the reactions from the press and also how Roosevelt responded to his about-face?
I wish I could say that the country was horrified at this turnabout, but it really, I mean, there were a few defections, even with his own party, people who said, gee, this isn't what we were expecting. Some who objected strongly to the seizure of gold, even from within his own party. But the atmosphere was so rife with distress and alarm about the state of the economy that there was a great deal of give him a chance. He gives wonderful, reassuring speeches. And so he didn't really get called on the carpet like he should have. And that turnaround didn't begin on the day he took office. It really began right after the election. In that interregnum, before March 4, when he took office, there were already signs that he wasn't going to go in some of the directions he promised during the campaign. And he very deliberately sabotaged some nascent signs of recovery by some of his statements before he took office, and some of the statements he refused to make to add some confidence to the economy. I think he really did want things to get bad before he took office so that he could take credit for any improvement. Roosevelt was not a hardcore, learned, ideological leftist. He was a political opportunist. And an opportunist who felt that he could score and be popular and get reelected if he went down this path of demagoguing the issues. And you look back on it and you think it would have really taken a man of great courage and integrity and character to say to the country in 1933, I'm sorry, I know you're hurting. I know you'd probably like it if I could send you a big check, but that's not the answer. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to cut spending like I promised and so forth. And we're going to stick it out until the economy recovers. But he chose another path, and I think instinctively he felt he could demagogue his way to success. And he did. He got reelected 3 times. It worked for him.
Hi, I just have a quick question. We're going over in our microeconomics class foreign investment, and you mentioned that one of the effects of the tariff is that we don't buy foreign goods, and so foreign countries, individuals there don't have dollars with which to buy American goods. And I was just wondering, because this was a question I had during the class also, would that problem exist if there weren't national currencies, and if, say, gold was the international currency? Would this problem exist of foreign countries not having, well, obviously it wouldn't happen, but could you just talk about what would be different?
Well, if we had, we came close to what you're alluding to when we had a largely international gold standard roughly 100 years ago, and for some period of time. It was an adulterated one, but it still came closer to every major trading country had some link between their paper currency and gold, a ratio at which they promised redemption of their paper into gold. And it's not by coincidence that, by and large, that was a period of huge expansion in international trade. Now, you could have a gold standard, I suppose, even an international one, and still have high tariff protectionist policies that would be very harmful. But when nations embrace the stability and the discipline of a gold standard, and I'm not arguing that that's the ideal monetary policy. I'm probably a little closer to Hayek and would, in the sense of wanting money to be determined by the market, and if it's gold, great, but if it's something else, I'd be happy with that too. But when nations embrace the discipline that gold suggests, it usually means they understand economics enough that they see the virtue of trade. So freer trade and an international gold standard usually go with each other, I think. I can't think of a period where you had sound money and rising protectionist sentiments, worldwide anyway. So I don't know if that's a very good answer to your question, but my prescription would be both sound money and very low tariffs. The lower the better.